Okay, are we ready to hear how big organizations make themselves secure? Are we ready to hear how it is how everyday's job of a cybersecurity information officer is, chief security information officer? So I'm going to start off by asking everybody to briefly introduce them, the current role, and then talk about how they got into cybersecurity. What was the first personal experience with cybersecurity? So Ahsan, should we start with you?
Sure. My name is Ahsan Mir. I am the CISO of Autodesk. I'll jump directly into when I started into cybersecurity. So when I was growing up in my undergrad, I knew some of my friends were buying these Chicago Bull hats and cowboy baseball hats, and they were arriving, and I was curious why was that happening, and later I found out that there was a lot of credit card fraud that was happening, and that was back in 1999. So I got interested in that, and after graduating, I realized security was one of the things that I wanted to focus on, and that's where it all started, and since then I've not looked back. Read more about security, started, most of the people who start from security start from Black Hat, so that's where I started as well. A lot of penetration testing, a lot of doing stuff that I should have known better not to do, but it's a learning experience, so now I'm here. David?
Hi everyone, I'm David Tsao and I work at Veeva Systems. We are a SaaS provider focused on the life science vertical, and what our main product is a document management solution that stores intellectual property and trade secrets for our life science customers. So there's a lot of high value data there. The way I got introduced to security, probably also in undergrad, where there's a handful of us that managed various labs, computer labs. This was back in the 90s when laptops were not super popular, so everyone had to go to these labs and work. And there was one lab in particular that there was a handful of students that for some reason chose to browse inappropriate websites all the time. And this is like a room of like 50 machines. And so when Microsoft came out with the patch, and I think it was like an RPC vulnerability, that if the machine were attacked, it would blue screen of death. The admin for that lab chose not to install that patch intentionally. And anytime these students would come in and kind of do the things that they aren't supposed to be doing, instead of trying to walk up to them and explain, this is not appropriate in this room, they would simply, from his machine, fire off that malformed packet and then just crash the machine. And then the student would be like, oh, what happened? Well, what were you doing? Well, see, you shouldn't go to these types of sites. They're just gonna take your machine down. So that's how I got introduced to security.
Nice. My name is Sandeep Poonen. I'm Information Security Officer for Cloud Services at VMware. VMware, I actually didn't even know where VMware was until I had my first interview there. It's one of the most beautiful campuses in Palo Alto, so definitely if you guys are in the neighborhood, you should check it out. My first experience into information security was actually when I came from India for college and I needed to get a job to support my scholarship, and I was the systems administrator in Unix. I think I could probably type a simple document in VI, so they gave me the job. But came in one day in the office, and apparently some professor's computer had been hacked. Turns out it was one of the interns working at it, one of my fellow students. But I learned a couple of things there in security that has stuck with me. One, how to react is extremely important. I didn't know how to solve the problem, but responding to it was an extremely important skill, muscle I needed to develop. But also that I didn't know a lot back then, and that I really needed to depend on the community. And so other students who knew more about security, knew more about Unix systems, I learned that the information security environment and the people are very helpful. And I've depended on them from the very first experience up until now.
My name is Rob Fry. I'm currently the VP of Engineering at a company called JASK, where we're doing autonomous SOC operations. As it's relevant to this conversation, before that I was working at Netflix, where I was actually one of the first security hires. I don't know if you guys have heard of Netflix before, but they're in cloud, and in cloud security they're kind of a big deal. So I spent about 8 years there, leaving about a year ago. As far as how I got into security, I'll have to go back to early 2000s. I was working for a utility company in Wisconsin, and I was in charge of technical operations for our international group, who was doing business all over the world. and had a particular nation state break into our network to look for plans on wind farm and solar technology that we were developing. And I found that was, back then when I was much younger than I am right now, just fascinating that another country would break into a corporation sitting out in the middle of Wisconsin and wanting to take information from them. And it definitely inspired me to continue down that route.
Thank you. So, my next question is, how has the role of a CISO or a security leader changed in the last decade? And all of you have been in cybersecurity in the last decade and seen a lot of changes happening. And how did you deal with those changes? And many of your companies have also undergone a lot of transformations as well. So, well, we'll start with Rob this time.
Yeah, so when I started, Netflix was a DVD corporation, and then we went to cloud. And the challenges with going to cloud, I remember going to conferences back in 2009, 2010, saying that this is the future, and people in the audience like you were laughing at me saying that cloud was crazy and stupid, and why would you want to go there, and compliance and all sorts of other different reasons. We did it because it gave us a competitive advantage. But what was also happening at the time is there was a lot of technology convergence that was happening, but there's also these things in the common eye that were happening, which were things like the target breach. Things that brought to the fore to the board, to the executive, like what's actually happening from the security realm. What we did a lot at that particular time, which we failed at, and I think a lot of CISOs did at the time, was they went into the board and went into C-suite talking security talk rather than business talk, and that was a big challenge. I know I got thrown out of a meeting because they told me to come back, and when you can talk about risk, we can talk about revenue in and revenue out, like we can have a serious conversation. And so I think that's been a really popular mode for the last few years, is going to the board with what's relevant to them and not necessarily what's relevant to security, relevant to the business, besides all the other things that are going on.
Yeah, I think, on so many different levels, the information security field has mushroomed and blossomed so much. I mean, in one of the fields in IT, as we've all worked probably in different fields of IT, information security is the one, I think, group where budgets are actually increasing and other groups, IT is decreasing. In information security, you've got people selling it for you. I mean, you just have to open any newspaper or newspapers are dated probably, go to any website, and you're probably seeing cybersecurity in the very front pages. I mean, we're talking about security changing or influencing who becomes the most powerful person in the world. I mean, that's the scope in which information security has blossomed in terms of the importance. So being able to speak to board and being able to speak now in the context of a security, you don't have to tell the board members that it's extremely important, but everybody's telling them that, including every news feed. Trying to being able to articulate what is important to the board for the particular company. There's so much noise. I mean, you go to any kind of vendor conference and thing, there's so much data to parse, and everybody's using the same buzzwords, right? Everybody's automating, everybody's innovating, everybody's using every technology possible. So it's wading through all of those things, I think, has become extremely important for the cybersecurity personnel to be able to understand the specifics about what different technologies work, where they really help, where they don't really help. And I mean, if you're not an athlete, if you're not absolutely, infinitely curious in information security, I think it'll become a very frustrating field.
And David and Ahsan, I'd love to double click on a couple of those things that Sandeep mentioned while you're giving your answers as well, like the being infinitely curious, and how do you communicate better with the board?
So certainly the space around security, at least in the area that I'm in around the life sciences, has evolved a lot over the past 5 to 10 years. Just the awareness of what state-sponsored attackers actually mean, and back in the day it was Echelon, and that's just a kind of a rumor that it existed, and now of course there's a lot more awareness there. So having that way to ask that question of, so what really are our threat actors, and being able to have that conversation with not only with our board, but our customers as well. A lot of it's customer education. So trying to explain from our perspective, we're moving into the cloud. Okay, well then what does that all entail? How do we ensure it's secure? It's usually the most common question that they would have. And we will see these customers year in and year out. And so the first conversations that we would have maybe 4 or 5 years ago were very fundamental around, okay, what are the basic principles that you have to have? And then each year that conversation has certainly evolved. So trying to anticipate what are the next questions and how will the bar get raised for what are the controls that our customers are looking for each year is an interesting challenge where we don't want to be not only caught off guard, but also to help guide that conversation with our customers as well. So it's really a two-way conversation that we end up having with them.
A CISO has to take care of product security directly or indirectly in some ways, right?
Yes, absolutely. That has to be part of the equation. Yep.
So I'll take this question slightly differently. Over the last 7 to 10 years, security has moved out of the IT organization as an independent organization, and that has to do with two things. One is how do we do computing has changed. We used to have data centers 10 years ago. A lot of people most of the startups don't have data centers. All the services that we consume are perhaps third-party services that we consume, and all the data we consume are hosted by someone else. So as data has moved out of our data centers, it has become important to make sure that it remains secure. And like Autodesk, our customers are entrusting their data, their intellectual property, their PII, to us, and that becomes part of our business proposition. And that's why it's becoming a board topic. Board is interested, are we doing enough to protect our customers and our shareholder interests? So that's their concern, and that's their motivation around understanding whether the risks within the organizations are effectively managed. One of the biggest risks is if you're not protecting your customers' intellectual property, your customers' PII, you're probably not going to be a viable business down the road. And that means that shareholder value will go down. And that question comes up often. What is your risk management strategy look like? How are you managing those risks? What are your key controls that can effectively mitigate the risks to that business? That's why we have also seen there is an ask from the board to come up from the security organization to come in and explain how the risks are being managed. Another thing that I would add is SEC regulations have come out that now require the board to have this oversight function. If there is a major breach, you have to file an 8K. So all of those things have to be in place, and the board plays a lot more active role in most of the security initiative across whether we are doing enough to manage risk across the environment.
Yeah, thank you. On that note, maybe we'll do like a rapid fire here. What are 2 or 3 areas where you're not seeing enough innovation in cybersecurity, both from startups and big vendors? Top of your mind, what are 2 or 3 areas where you think there's a lot more innovation left to be done? Who wants to go first?
I would actually argue it's almost the other way around, right? So there's too many solutions that are out there. There's too many tools. The biggest constraint typically on a security team is not having a tool, but it's having the people. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the people to operate the tools. And so how can we flip that conversation to help solve the problems as opposed to offering yet another solution?
I'll jump in. And I was having this conversation with Sandeep before I came in here. I was at a CISO conference a few years ago. Number 1 problem, not enough people in security, shortage. Number 2 problem, I'm not getting enough from my security stack because of problem number 1, not enough people to operate it. And so I asked the question back, tell me about your hiring practice. And the bar was way up here. And it's a self-defeating problem, right? From the vendor side, which I'm on now, we're not doing enough to lower the bar to have people that you can hire that don't have to be up here in order to make them capable inside of security sooner. So one of the problems from the vendor side is how do we take our technology and make it easier to understand, make it easier to operate, and not necessarily be technical. There's a lot of UI, UX around that. There's a lot of jargon that's out there. There's a lot of FUD that goes into that. But ultimately, if I look just from the UI, UX space, I see a lot of talent that goes to the gaming industry, goes to finance, goes to healthcare. How do we pull people in from those particular areas in order to be able to help address that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll double down on that point too, which is, I mean, I think as I've interacted with different quote-unquote masters in any space, whether it is, I mean, if you watch interviews with sports people or anybody who really knows their craft, one thing I've noticed about them is they're able to make things very simple. And one of the phrases that I've always caught is one of those things that you want to make things very Sesame Street simple. Sesame Street has that ability to make alphabets or words very simple for children, very small children. And I think in the security industry, there's so much FUD, so much overuse of jargon that there really is a need for the true masters in the space, whether it is in AI or whether it's PhDs in computer science, whatever, to really be able to distill this problem very simply through technology, through different capabilities, to have the right visualizations, the right animations, to make it simple for the vast majority of consumers. We heard about fraud. It may work well in enterprise, it may not work well in consumers. How do I make consumers really understand the threat of fraud so that they do buy into MFA, right? And things like that, as was talked in the previous session. I mean, I think we need to come up with innovative solutions to really solve that at scale.
I would say two innovations. One is organizational innovation. Perhaps not a technology innovation is needed. We need to rethink about what the security staffing we need, separate out administrative functions to more effectively use the security staff and capabilities we have. I think we need to double down on that because we are nowhere near solving the security staffing and resourcing and skill set problem. The other thing that I would say, we really need innovation in doing the basics right. We focus on a lot of things that sound really interesting, but we are missing out on the basics. So if there is a need for innovation, it has to be, how do we make security invisible to the user by doing the very basic things that needs to be done? The hygiene is extremely important.
Yeah, so can you elaborate on the basics?
Do asset management. I think we have a major issue with asset management. If you can't do if you don't know what your enterprise looks like, you can't protect it. Do vulnerability management well. If you are able to harden your system and do your vulnerability management practices well, attackers will have a hard time getting in. So these are some of the basic things that are always been there and are operationally perhaps are not at the level where they should be. I think the innovation is in that space.
So how has cloud and open source changed the equation on those two questions? Asset management and vulnerability management.
It has made it more complex.
Yeah.
I think the data is fluid. It flows where it needs to go to make a business proposition. So it has made it much more harder. So I'll let other folks chime in on that.
So I would say that in the cloud front, we're definitely in a transformation where technology is evolving, where if you kind of went straight into the current designs of an infrastructure as a service provider, yes, the asset management, vulnerability management problem definitely still there. But there's a clear direction towards microservices and service mesh where you can containerize your services. And what's interesting is I think it's the first concept that I've seen where security by design has truly been built in throughout that entire product approach. So you can get kind of out of the box now. You don't have to worry about patching because you're always going to be running the latest container OS. You don't have to worry about authentication and identity because these services will self-register. Now, I mean, this is things that are still very much in the cutting edge. If you look at Istio and Envoy, they're still kind of maturing in that space. But it looks like this is the first chance that security will have where we're not always behind the game and always having a separate product. Now it's actually kind of built into that core architecture from the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think also what I'll add to it, I mean, I think this is maybe it's a human nature issue that I've had to kind of keep telling myself. I can either look at this problem as the tendency is to always look at it as all the bad guys, all the crazy things that can go wrong. And so with cloud and all of these different things that come in, it's made it infinitely more complex for sure. We have systems that are spun up for a few seconds and then spun down. Vulnerability is on there. Some bad guy may have gotten through something and then has jumped somewhere else. So there's a whole lot of complicated issues that come up because of the cloud.
Half-life has gone down a lot.
Right. But I could also look at it as the power of good that can happen because of cloud and because of all those things. And I tend to, we try at VMware, I know Vijay, I mean from VMware here too, is also, we tend to spend a lot of our time thinking, look, the good, we've got good on our side. You know, we've got home court advantage. This is our building, this is our space, this is our area. Let's look at how we can harness technology, how we can leverage AI and all these things to really pursue the good that was in there. And let's say we think about IP whitelisting or all those things, that's the good. Well, how do you expand that to scale? So that's how I look at it and saying, look, I can, kill myself thinking, sit in the corner in the fetal position because of all the bad things that could go wrong. Or I can energize myself and say, look, here's all the good that this cloud and all these things can harness. Let's try to leverage some of that.
Man, that's a hard one. I could go all sorts of different ways based off what you guys said. So I think I'll look at it from the business side. We didn't go to cloud because it was more secure. We went to cloud because it was operationally advantageous to run there for the business side. But there are caveats to that. And I remember I was presenting at a conference 7 years ago about going to cloud, and I got challenged on it. And I asked a gentleman what company he was from, and then I figured out what his CIDR block was, and then I scanned his entire CIDR block, and I figured out where his Exchange server is, and then I scanned and I figured out he had a vulnerability on his Exchange server. And I said, now, are you better secure right now than if you move that to Gmail? Where I know that there's like 500 guys that are protecting Gmail and it's encrypted, and even if you pop Gmail, that you have to fight against 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 other customers. So it's kind of the herd methodology. So while going to cloud, there's a lot of security challenges. The security challenges can't be lost on the fact that you're pushed there because it's advantageous for the business. But there are ways, like David was saying, around, like at Netflix, when we had microservices, an instance that was sitting on the front end, on the edge, it had an average lifetime of like 3 hours. And the TTL on the TLS cert was an hour. So even if you popped an external resource, you had a limited amount of time. Now, we didn't do that because it was secure. We did that because the operational cost of having a server sitting up there for 24/7 was high. You wanted horizontal scale. It was an advantage for the business. But when you adopt that type of methodology, security becomes part of it. And what I see as a mistake on people is they just take data center methodology, go to the cloud and implement data center methodology in the cloud and not rethink and leverage what cloud is good for, and then reap the benefits from it.
I would just add to that absolutely cloud provides so much advantages to starting fresh and really building security right. The opportunity that it provides by having instances that don't need to be patched but can be brought down and brought up secure. And all those other capabilities that are perhaps harder to achieve in data centers can be achieved much more easily in the cloud. So cloud provides a lot of advantage if you want to do things securely.
So since the theme of the conference is imagination, AI, so I'm going to put the last question on AI before we open it up to the audience. In the context of cybersecurity, where do you think AI can work? And please feel free to define AI first in the way in which you think it's most appropriate for you. And where do you think AI cannot work? There's a lot of AI washing happening in the industry. Every cybersecurity pitch that we have seen in our firm from startups in the last year includes AI somewhere. AI, ML, DL, whatever you want to call it, right? So, yeah, why don't we, I would love to get all of your thoughts on where it works, where it cannot work, what's AI for you?
I'm going to go probably a different direction than these guys, because usually that goes straight to security. And both at Netflix and different companies I've worked at, I'll use deep learning as an example. One of the challenges inside of security is data volume. That's where ML and AI tend to have issues. We've heard the last two panelists talk about this. Where I saw opportunity is with deep learning, one of the things it does really well is data duplication. If you're saying that there's massive sets of data out there, if you have a data pipeline and you're trying to ingest 10 gig a second, but you're able to do data duplication, there's appropriate existing normal methodology, prior art that exists out there that can help the security problem. It doesn't always have to be around detection. You can do more simplistic things to do that. When it comes to a lot of the detection stuff that I'm sure these guys will get to, the way that I would just sum that up is everybody's trying to invent algorithms and trying to use AI and ML in novel ways, but there's a lot of existing prior art out there as well that you can leverage. And the missing thing for me from the security side is the lack of context. inside of algorithms. An algorithm cannot solve the security problem alone. Whether it's instrumentation, user information, threat intel information, these are the things that need to be added to it that haven't been done in the past that can make ML and AI more useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think algorithms are helped in the context by having lots of data. Right? The more data you have and the more good data you have, the ability to get that context will become easier over time. And so the way I look at it, the way we've also looked at solving this problem is the volume, the sheer volume of good data that we have far outweighs the volume of bad data. What I mean by that is, if you take all the sum total of all the hackers and all they've done, you got a bunch of signatures out there and all that. The amount of good data, which is normal traffic that users are using every day, day in and out, the way the applications are running normally without incident, far outweigh the bad incidents or where something went awry, right? So I think if we can take, again, specifically machine learning, volume data, artificial intelligence to build good heuristics, to use all of that good data to ensure good, rather than constantly spending our intelligence trying to chase the bad, is one of the mantras that I think I've learned from the security experts that I've kind of got involved myself at VMware. So we're trying to harness that, our efforts in that, in ensuring good. And I think just one other point that I'd make is in ensuring good in security, we're trying to identify good patterns and bad patterns, things like that. It's not just a computer science problem. Since we're also talking about people and all those kind of things, it's not just machines going rogue. It's usually humans behind that. It's not just a computer science problem, it's a sociology problem. It's a history problem. It's a psychology problem. And so I think looking at, again, this relates to how we look at talent in the security space. It's not just people who got a computer science degree that are going to have to help solve this problem. There are people who also bring in this experience and expertise from no matter what their major in college was, to really have a whole brain looking at solving these problems. And then you got there's a lot more use cases, there's a lot more of AI that you need to depend on to factor that in. So those are some of the ways in which I see us solving the problem.
So I would definitely echo what has just been said. We are actually, we have several security solutions, and JASK, admittedly, in full disclosure, is one of them that we use to leverage machine learning techniques to look for that signal to help improve the security operations and response capabilities. The interesting question that's coming up now is where along that data life and that flow of data should we be implementing ML or these techniques? Because the closer you get to the upstream systems, theoretically the higher quality that signal will be. At the same time, you don't necessarily have the context and the enrichment that Rob had just mentioned. So it's difficult to inject all the threat intel information, in all the upstream systems. It's easier to inject it downstream. And so having those types of internal discussions around where do we need to make those decisions and trying to and kind of bring up those quality signals is an interesting one. The flip side of it is looking at how to implement ML in different ways. I think it's fairly easy these days. If you look at your favorite cloud provider, let's just pick AWS, and you go implement SageMaker. I mean, it's managed for you. You can actually fairly easily go ahead and explore those different frameworks you wish to test out, whether that's TensorFlow or MXNet. So I think that we're trying to evaluate that in parallel as we are in the process of leveraging third-party solutions, but also trying to figure out what are the best ways that internally to the business we can also learn from those experiences and then find out how we can potentially build that and incorporate that into our product or into our enterprise systems as well.
So I have a book recommendation for you guys if you're interested in AI. It's Life 3.0 from Future of Life Institute. It starts by explaining. It talks about this hypothetical company that has invented artificial general intelligence and what artificial general intelligence does by breaking out of its bound and starts social engineering people who have created it. It's an extremely interesting read that opened my mind up of what artificial intelligence might be capable of doing. So we are looking at from the defensive side, but you should also think about it from the adversarial side, what AI would be able to do to beat systems that we are creating. So that should also be kept in mind that there are two sides to this coin. So what I've mostly seen, the use of AI is basically it's a large classifier. And with all classifiers, it's about data set and attribute extraction, and that's where we have problems. Whenever we have tried implementing it, we have hard time figuring out what are the attributes that we need to extract and classify. And most of the time, what we have realized is statistical modeling that we have used for anomaly detection previously, in most cases, work as well as any of the ML solutions that are out there. Perhaps over time, we will have better and better attribute extraction. There are use cases. There are vendors that are doing some really good stuff in this space. But I think there's a lot of research that needs to go in there and prove the value of where it needs to be, where it's a valid application of ML and AI.
Thank you. So I only wish we had another 30 minutes, but thank you for the exciting thoughts and panel discussions. Back to basics. Never forget that. AI can work in cybersecurity. There's level of automation higher, and keep hiring great people, right? So thank you.
Thank you.